The chains on the inside of the Salarian Gate had not been lifted from the inside in 800 years. On the night of August 23rd, 410, 2 hours after midnight, somebody inside Rome lifted them. And the reason that happened, the real reason, not the one you were told in school, is that the Emperor of Rome refused to answer a series of letters. 3 embassies, 3 written proposals, each one delivered to the imperial palace 200 miles north of the city. Each one refused without explanation, referred to a commission, or simply ignored. The man sending the letters did not want to destroy Rome. He wanted a place inside it. The man receiving them would rather let the city fall than admit he needed help. Not in a great rush, not with shouting. The chronicles all agree on the quietness of the moment the gate opened. A bolt drawn, a bar set aside, a leaf of the double gate swung inward on its bronze pin. Outside, on the Via Salaria, the Visigothic king Alaric had been camped for the better part of a year, watching the northern face of the Aurelian wall and waiting for somebody inside to stop being proud. The first men through the gate did not loot. The Chronicle of Olympiodorus, preserved in the Patriarch Photios 2.5 centuries later, says they secured the gatehouse and the adjoining tower and waited for the column. The looting started later, with daylight. The discipline of the first hours mattered enough that even non-Christian writers, whose instinct would have been to describe chaos, recorded the discipline instead. This was the 3rd sack of Rome since the founding of the city. The Gauls under Brennus in 390 BC, a nameless faction under Sulla and again under Caesar, but those were Romans against Romans. The Visigoths in 410 were the first foreign army through the walls in 8 centuries. That number is the line every chronicler writing afterward returned to. 800 years of inviolability ended in one night. This is not the story of how barbarians broke Rome. This is the story of how an emperor's silence built the perfect trap and then complained when the trap closed. The court was at Ravenna. It had been moved there 8 years earlier, in 402, when Honorius, who was now around 17 and who had been emperor since the age of 10, could no longer feel safe in Milan. Ravenna sat behind miles of salt marsh and standing water. The roads in were narrow causeways. No army could move on it in formation. Procopius of Caesarea, writing the history of the Vandal Wars from 120 years away, describes the geography with the clarity of a man who knew water defends better than walls. They had pigeons there, he writes, with which they were greatly delighted, and which were fed inside the palace. I read that passage in Procopius 3 times before I noticed what he isn't saying. He isn't telling us about the pigeons because he likes birds. He is telling us, with the dryness of a Byzantine official who has watched the same pattern repeat itself in his own century, that the imperial court in Ravenna had become a place where adult men spent their days fussing over a coop, while 400 kilometers south, the largest city in the world was being slowly strangled by a Visigothic army no one had paid. There were, by the count of Olympiodorus, 3 full embassies sent by Alaric to Honorius in the months before the city was taken. 3. Each one with a price tag in gold and grain. Each one delivered to Ravenna and read aloud in the consistorium, the inner council. Each one refused. The men who refused them included a chamberlain whose name was Olympius, not to be confused with the historian Olympiodorus, who reports him with the particular distaste a chronicler reserves for the courtier who got everyone he knew killed. Olympius the chamberlain was a Greek from somewhere in the western provinces, a pious civilian who had risen through court service to the position of Magister Officiorum, the master of offices, which made him the man who actually decided which letters reached the emperor. He would not last long in office. By the time the city fell, he had already been beaten to death in a back room of the palace, his ears cut off by his successor's order. Zosimus, who hates almost everyone, takes a particular satisfaction in describing the death. He may have been right to. I will come back to him. For now it is enough to know that the silence that destroyed Rome was not a silence of incompetence. It was a silence of policy. The court at Ravenna had decided, deliberately, that to negotiate with Alaric was to admit that the Western Empire could no longer keep its own house. So they did not negotiate. They sent letters back saying nothing. They referred matters to commissions. They invited Alaric north and then refused to receive him. They executed his hostages. They moved the Magister Militum from one province to another and back again, hoping to find a competent general by lottery. And while they did this, the Visigoths, 80,000 of them, with women and wagons and the children they had brought out of the Balkans, sat outside Rome and slowly ate everything in the suburbs. By the autumn of 408, the price of bread inside the city had risen to a level the prefect Pompeianus could no longer hide. The Roman Senate, which had been a formality for 2 centuries, woke up and started to send its own embassies over the head of the court. Around the table sat men whose families had held consulships in the time of Augustus, and they were now negotiating in their own name with a Visigothic king, because the emperor in Ravenna had stopped answering his mail. If the period interests you, the broken ladder of the West, the chronicles that argue with each other about every name, the small decisions that lost provinces, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to the gate before dawn. By the night of 24th August 410, Alaric had been encamped outside Rome on and off for almost 3 years. This was his 3rd siege of the city. The first, in late 408, he had broken off after the Senate paid him £5,000 of gold, £30,000 of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed hides, and £3,000 of pepper. I will come back to the pepper. The second, in 409, he had broken off after the same Senate, in despair, had crowned a puppet emperor of its own, a city prefect named Priscus Attalus, and tried to use Attalus as leverage against Honorius. That had failed too, because Attalus, who had been chosen for being pliable, turned out to be merely vain, and within months Alaric had stripped him of the purple in a public ceremony at Rimini and given the diadem back to the Visigothic camp as a souvenir. The 3rd siege was the one that took. To understand how the imperial court let it get this far, you have to go back 15 years, to the night the Emperor Theodosius died in Milan in January 395, leaving a half-Vandal general named Stilicho holding both halves of the Roman Empire together with his right hand and a boy emperor with his left. There is a bedroom in Milan in January 395 that we know about only through 3 sources, and the 3 do not agree. The Emperor Theodosius was 48. He had just returned from defeating the Western usurper Eugenius at the Frigidus River in Slovenia 4 months earlier, a battle in which a fortuitous wind, or the prayers of the Bishop Ambrose, or the cavalry of his half-Vandal general Stilicho had broken the Western army on a single afternoon. The detail you choose depends on which chronicler you read. Orosius says wind. Augustine says prayer. Zosimus, the pagan, says the cavalry. I lean toward the cavalry because the others are theology. Theodosius did not live the year out. He was sick by November, dying by January. The army was gathered around Milan because the emperor had not yet had time to send it back east. In the bedroom, by the Count of Ambrose's funeral oration delivered 40 days later, were the dying emperor, his 10-year-old son Honorius, the 17-year-old Stilicho, and an unnamed eunuch of the bedchamber whose presence the bishop tactfully omits. There may have been a will. Stilicho would later say there was, and that it appointed him guardian of both of Theodosius's sons, of Honorius in the west, and of the elder son Arcadius, 18, in the east. The chronicler Zosimus, who hates Stilicho with the steady passion a pagan civilian reserved for a Christian general, says the will was a forgery written after the fact. Modern historians are split. Peter Heather thinks the regency was real. Walter Goffert thinks Stilicho seized the moment and dressed it up afterwards. I lean toward Heather because the man Theodosius had just married to his own niece Serena and then to his nephew would have been the natural choice. But I admit the evidence is thin. What is not thin is what happened next. Within 4 months, the empire was split into 2 courts that began arguing about every customs post, every grain shipment, every disputed province between them. Honorius in the west was a boy who liked horses and the open air and would later prefer pigeons. Arcadius in the east was an older boy who liked silence and let his court speak for him. Neither of them ever ruled in any practical sense. The men around them ruled, and from 395 onward, those men were at war with each other through their child emperors, without ever quite saying so. Stilicho was the most competent of them and the most isolated. His mother was Roman, his father a Vandal cavalry officer in Valens's service. The chronicler Claudian, who wrote panegyrics for him in beautiful Latin verse, calls him the only fortress of Italy. Even Claudian's rivals admit the description. Between 395 and 408, Stilicho fought Alaric in the Balkans, fought Alaric at Pollentia in 402, fought Alaric again at Verona later the same year, fought a Gothic warband under Radagaisus near Florence in 406, fought a Vandal and Suevic incursion across the Rhine on the last day of 406. He held the West together with 30,000 soldiers, 2/3 of them barbarian foederati, and a treasury that had not been replenished since Theodosius died. In 398, he married his daughter Maria to the boy emperor Honorius. Maria was 11. The marriage was not consummated, by Claudian's report, for several years. When Maria died of fever in 408, Stilicho married his second daughter, Thermantia, to Honorius. Thermantia was 12. By Olympiodorus, who is our calmest witness, Honorius treated both wives politely and slept in another wing of the palace. There were no children. The Theodosian line ran through Honorius and one half-Vandal general, and the general was running out of time. I do not want to make Stilicho into a saint. He had 2 of the Eastern minister Rufinus's officers killed in 395 on a public parade ground in Constantinople, an act so blatant that it gave the Eastern court a permanent grudge. He overrode the Senate when it suited him. He made and broke peace with Alaric 4 times. But the question that the chroniclers keep circling: was Stilicho a Roman or a Vandal? Did he serve the empire or use it? Is, I think, the wrong question. Stilicho was a Roman officer of the late 4th century who happened to have a Vandal father, in an army where every other officer also had a barbarian father. The court at Ravenna would eventually decide, for entirely political reasons, that this fact disqualified him. In doing so, it killed the only man who could have prevented what came next. The court that killed him formed slowly around the chamberlain Olympius. Olympius was a Christian civilian from the western provinces. The chronicler Zosimus, who knew him personally and despised him, calls him a man who covered ambition with piety. He had risen through the corps of palace secretaries, the Scrinia, and by 407 he had Honorius's ear. He had been waiting, by all accounts, for an opening. In the summer of 408, he found one. What happened next was Pavia. On the 13th of August, 408, the Emperor Honorius left Ravenna and travelled to Pavia, then called Ticinum, where the field army of Italy was concentrated. The journey was nominally for a military review. In fact, Olympius had spent the previous week speaking privately to officers and soldiers, accusing Stilicho of every charge he could invent. That Stilicho was plotting to put his own son, Eucherius, on the eastern throne, that he had taken bribes from Alaric, that he was conspiring with the Vandals, None of it was documented. None of it needed to be. By the time the emperor reached Pavia, the army had been worked up to the point of mutiny. On August 22nd, exactly 2 years to the day before the Salarian Gate would open, the soldiers at Pavia rose. They did not rise against Stilicho directly. They rose against his officers, the men he had appointed across the western provinces in the previous decade. Limenius, the praetorian prefect of Gaul, was cut down in the street. Chariobaudus, the magister equitum, was killed in the same hour. Vincentius, the magister militum per Gallias. Salvius, the quaestor. Petronus, the comes sacrarum largitionum. The chamberlains of the bedchamber. A list of names so long that Zosimus says he gives only those he can remember by heart. In one afternoon, the entire administrative spine of the Western Army, the network of officers who had served under Stilicho since 395, was broken. The men who knew how to move grain to the front, who could call up Federate cavalry, who knew which Gothic chiefs were owed which payments, they were dead by sunset. I want to be careful here. I am about to describe Stilicho's own death 4 days later, and I want you to feel what was lost. Not in slogans, not in the abstract, but in the way a quiet man feels it when he is asked to walk out into an open courtyard one last time, knowing the soldiers waiting outside have been told he is the cause of every grief they carry. Stilicho was around 49. He had been a Roman officer for most of his adult life. He had buried 2 daughters in the imperial purple. He had a wife and a young son still alive. When the news from Pavia reached him at Bononia, modern Bologna, he did the thing a man does who has spent his whole life inside the chain of command. He went to a church. Specifically, he went to the Cathedral of Ravenna, and he claimed the right of asylum at the altar, a right the church had been granted by his old patron Theodosius in 392, and which Stilicho had himself extended in legislation in 398. The bishop received him. The doors were closed. Outside, by Zosimus, an officer named Heracleon arrived from Ravenna with a written order from Honorius. The order said that Stilicho was to be arrested and tried in due process. Heracleon swore an oath in the bishop's presence that the order said only what it said. The bishop opened the doors. Stilicho walked out of the church into the courtyard. Heracleon had a second order in his sleeve. As soon as Stilicho was off the consecrated ground, Heracleon produced the second order, which authorized his immediate execution. Stilicho's bodyguard reached for their weapons. Stilicho stopped them. He said, by Zosimus, and Zosimus heard this from men who were there, that he would not be the cause of his men's deaths, and that he had served Rome long enough to know how this kind of court worked. He knelt. They cut his head off in the courtyard. His son Eucharius, who was 18, was hunted down in Rome within the week and killed in a private house. Thermantia, the emperor's wife, was stripped of her title and sent back to what was left of her mother, Serena, in Rome. Serena would be strangled by the Senate 2 years later, in 410, on a rumor that she had been corresponding with Alaric. This is the story the chroniclers keep returning to, how a court got rid of the only man holding the West together because the man's father had been a Vandal, and the men who replaced him spent the next year arranging the conditions under which a different Vandal-adjacent army would walk into the city itself. Alaric heard of Stilicho's death within 10 days. He had been negotiating with him for the last 16 years, off and on. He had married into the family of the Visigothic royal line, but he had also been a Roman officer at Frigidus and at Pollentia, on commission, drawing pay. He understood the imperial system from the inside. He had been asking for one thing the entire time: a legal status, magister militum, federate allotment, treasury supply, that would give his people a place inside the empire instead of permanently outside it. With Stilicho dead, there was nobody in Ravenna who knew Alaric well enough to negotiate. The new master of the palace, Olympius, had no patience for foederati. He cancelled the payments Stilicho had committed to. He ordered the families of barbarian soldiers in the Western army held as hostages, and when the soldiers found out, 30,000 of them deserted to Alaric within the month, swelling his army to a size no court in Ravenna could ignore. In the autumn of 408, Alaric crossed the Julian Alps and entered Italy. He did not march on Ravenna, which he knew was unreachable, and he did not march on Milan, which he knew was empty. He marched on Rome, not to destroy it, to use it as the lever that would force Ravenna to talk. The first embassy from the city to Alaric in November 408 asked him his terms. He named gold, silver, silk, hides and pepper. 3,000 pounds of pepper by Zosimus's count, the figure that everyone laughs at when they read it, but that meant, in the spice economy of the late 4th century, a guarantee of trade routes from the Indian Ocean still open. The Senate paid. Alaric pulled back to Tuscany. He sent envoys to Ravenna proposing a treaty, a federate allotment in Noricum, the provinces along the upper Danube, a generalship in the Western army, an annual subsidy. Anywhere else, any other court, this would have been the end of the story. Olympius refused. He refused in writing. He refused without explanation. He referred the matter to a commission. The commission did nothing. The winter passed. In the spring of 409, Alaric came back to Rome. Olympius himself did not last long. Within months, he had been removed by a palace faction, exiled, recalled, and finally beaten to death in a Ravenna back room. By Zosimus's account, with his ears cut off first to make him confess to bribery. His successor, Jovius, was an old friend of Alaric's from Federate days. Jovius met Alaric at Rimini and offered him a treaty close to what he had been asking for. They almost had a deal. Then a letter arrived from Honorius at Ravenna, written in the emperor's own hand, refusing it. The letter, by Zosimus, called Alaric barbarian 3 times in 2 paragraphs and offered him nothing. Jovius read the letter aloud to Alaric. Alaric stood up from the table and rode back to his army. He had been refused by 3 administrations in a row, each one for different reasons, none of them the real one. The real reason was that the court at Ravenna had decided, deliberately, that to give Alaric the legal status he asked for would be to admit that the Western Empire could no longer keep its own house in its own hand. Honorius would rather lose Rome than admit it. He did not believe, even then, that Alaric would actually take the city. By Procopius, writing from Constantinople a century and a quarter later, with the dryness of a Byzantine official who has watched the same pattern repeat itself in his own century, the emperor was not, in those months, an unhappy man. He had married for the 2nd time and was childless. He had outlived his father-in-law and his sister-in-law. He had a palace, a court, a pigeon coop, and the marshes around him. The chronicler does not say he was thinking about Rome at all. In August 410, Alaric came back to the Salarian Gate for the 3rd time. The Senate had no more gold. The granaries were empty. The puppet emperor Attalus had been stripped of his diadem and sent home in disgrace. Famine had been inside the walls for months. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem the next year, would record that mothers in Rome had eaten their children, a claim no other source confirms, but no other source quite denies either. The Visigothic camp on the Via Salaria settled in for what would have been a 4th siege. It lasted 9 days. On the 9th day, 2 hours after midnight, the chains on the inside of the Salarian Gate were lifted from the inside. In the household of a Christian senator named Pamachius, on the southern slope of the Aventine, a household slave called Crescentia woke before dawn on August 24th and went down to the kitchen to draw water from the cistern. She would not have heard the gate yet. The Salarian Gate stood on the opposite side of the city, on the northern wall, 8 Roman miles of street and small hill in between. The chains had been lifted perhaps 3 hours earlier. The first Visigothic columns were now moving south down the Via Salaria into the Campus Martius. Crescentia, by the time she had filled her bucket and started up the back stairs, would have heard horses on a stone street, a noise that meant something specific in a city where horses were not permitted in the streets during daylight by an edict of Augustus's. She would have heard it and put the bucket down. This detail comes from no chronicle. I am making it up. A slave named Crescentia, an Aventine kitchen, because the chronicles do not, in fact, tell us what most of the people inside Rome did on 24th August 410. The chronicles tell us what the senators and the bishops did. They tell us what Alaric did. They do not tell us what 800,000 other Romans heard and saw and feared and tried to hide. So I am inventing a slave woman with a bucket, and I want you to know I am inventing her because the silence of the chronicles on this point is itself a piece of evidence, and because the alternative, pretending we know, would be the kind of lie this channel does not tell. What the chronicles do tell us is that the discipline of the Visigothic army on 24th, 25th, and 26th August was the thing that surprised everybody. Orosius, writing 6 years later for a Christian audience in Carthage, makes it the centerpiece of his account. The Visigoths, who were Arian Christians, that is, they held that Christ was created by the Father rather than co-eternal with him, a doctrine the Council of Nicaea had condemned in 325, declared the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul places of asylum and stationed guards at the doors. Anybody, Roman or otherwise, who reached the basilicas was untouched. The chronicler Augustine, writing The City of God across the next 13 years from Hippo Regius in North Africa, returns to this point again and again. The pagan gods had not saved Rome. The Christian sanctuary, declared by an Arian Goth, had. Procopius preserves a small story from this point, and it is the story most people who have heard anything about the sack of Rome have heard. The court at Ravenna learned of the fall of Rome by a courier. Procopius does not tell us when the courier arrived, only that it was within a few days, which would put it around 28th or 29th August. The courier was brought into the palace and into the presence of the Emperor Honorius. Honorius was, by Procopius, in the chamber where his pet birds were kept, which is the same room from the opening of this story, the pigeon coop or aviary that the chronicler had already singled out as the emblem of the imperial court's distance from its own empire. The emperor had a favorite cockerel. The favorite cockerel was named Roma. When the courier said, "Rome has perished," Honorius, by Procopius, cried out and said the bird had been in his hand a moment ago, and how could the news be true? The courier explained. The emperor was relieved. He had thought for a moment that the courier meant the bird. I have stood with this passage in Procopius for 15 years, and I cannot tell you whether it is true. It does not appear in any source closer to 410 than Procopius is, and Procopius is writing in Constantinople around 545, more than a century afterward. He has every reason to make the Western imperial court look foolish, because the Eastern emperor he serves, Justinian, is at war with the Vandals and the Goths, and wants the Western experiment of 395 to look like a failure of management. The anecdote may be borrowed from somewhere else. It may have been invented by an Italian wit and remembered as gossip for 100 years before reaching Constantinople. But I lean toward keeping it. I lean toward keeping it because every other thing we know about Honorius's response to the sack confirms its spirit, even if not its letter. He sent no army. He sent no embassy. He demanded no return of plunder. By the autumn of 410, Alaric, who had taken Rome in order to force Honorius to negotiate, was reduced to marching south through Campania with the Visigothic army and the imperial sister Galla Placidia as a hostage, looking for ships to invade Africa, because the court at Ravenna had still not answered his letter. He did not find the ships. a storm broke up the fleet he requisitioned at Rhegium. He turned back north. By the end of 410, somewhere in the Bruttian hills, he died. By Jordanes, who is writing in the next century, of a fever that took him in a few days. His warband buried him by diverting the bed of the river Bucentinus near Cosenza, laying him in the riverbed with his treasure and letting the water back. The slaves who did the digging were killed, so they could not tell where. The grave has never been found, which is the chronicler's way of saying it never will be. Alaric was succeeded by his brother-in-law Atholf. Within 4 years, Atholf had married Galla Placidia in a public ceremony at Narbonne in January 414, the same Galla Placidia who was the daughter of Theodosius, the sister of Honorius, the imperial flesh that had been carried south as a hostage. Olympiodorus, who was probably there, describes the wedding. The bride wore Roman silks. The groom wore a Roman general's cloak. Their first son, born late 414 in Barcelona, was named Theodosius. That is the historiographic argument I want to lay out in the middle of this final part, because it is the argument that decides what the sack of Rome actually was. Peter Heather, writing in 2005, argues that the sack of 410 was a political shock, designed to force the Western Empire to give Alaric what he had been asking for in writing since 395, which was a legal status inside the imperial system. On Heather's reading, the sack failed, not because Alaric was incompetent, but because the court at Ravenna was so far from political reality by 410 that no shock could reach it. The Vandals took Africa 20 years later under similar logic, and Genseric, who knew the lesson of Alaric, made sure his shock was permanent. Walter Goffert, writing earlier, argued that the entire federate settlement model has been misread by historians since Gibbon, that Alaric and his people were always inside the Roman system, drawing pay and bearing standards, and that what happened in 410 was not